Hello and welcome to the Commission Files. I'm Will Leach. This podcast is made at Commission Christian Radio in Dundonald, outside Belfast. Now, do you know this voice?
Harvard University just did something no other school has. It stood up to Donald Trump. The Ivy League giant has rejected the president's order to crack down on campus activism, end diversity programmes and silence student protests.
Award-winning journalist, reporter, correspondent, man on the telly, man of faith. My guest is all those things, and whilst that's to be admired, there's a lot more. The broadcaster Sky News has a Senior Ireland Correspondent currently assigned to cover the USA. He's David Blevins, Dr. David Blevins, and he's right here. David, welcome to Commission, and you've been here before, haven't you?
I have. I was shown around this building a little tour some years ago, and it's a bit like coming home because I drove past this road many times in my first job in broadcasting up the road at Downtown Radio.
Yeah, of course. Well, welcome. It's lovely to see you here, and thanks for coming in. I'm going to start by giving folk listening a wider idea of just some of the kinds of things you report on, have reported on. Listen to this little mix of stories.
It's a long way from Normandy, but the occupants of this lighthouse on the west coast of Ireland changed the course of D-Day with a weather warning. Simon Harris, you were Taoiseach Prime Minister at the age of 37, a Cabinet Minister aged 29, a TD Member of Parliament at 24. But all over the Western world, electorates are rejecting career politicians. So why should they vote for you?
Well, I'd ask people to vote for me based on the plan that we have.
Mary Lou McDonald, there's really only one place we can start today. Suella Braverman, your instant reaction to the comparisons she made in the Times.
Well, I think it demonstrates.
But this night is as notable for what happened on the floor as it is for what was said from the podium. Elon Musk back in a suit and back sharing the limelight with the President of the United States. A congressman evicted from the chamber for protesting. Perhaps we shouldn't be surprised by that sense of unity from the First and Deputy First Ministers. Remember, by accepting the nomination to become Deputy First Minister, the first unionist ever to hold that office, Emma Little Pengelly facilitated the election of Michelle O'Neill as First Minister, and she's the first nationalist to ever hold that office. And that really is quite remarkable, because one of these women is the daughter of a former IRA prisoner and the other the daughter of a former Loyalist prisoner.
That's you, David, reporting, explaining, interviewing, challenging, analysing, pointing out. How would you even describe your job now?
Waffling on the telly, pretending you know an awful lot more than you do. I work for a global news network, so sometimes when people have a lot of knowledge about one particular subject, they are like 6 foot deep of walking knowledge. When you're working for a global news network where you are covering stories at home and abroad at times, I describe it as a broad knowledge, but it's only about 6 centimetres deep. A little bit of knowledge about a lot of things rather than that 6 foot deep of knowledge.
So when we see you on the telly live, you know enough to get through that live?
Exactly, just enough, and normally a little bit to spare in case the presenter in London asks you a third question you weren't expecting, but you know all about that, Will.
I think you do yourself a disservice because, of course, any good correspondent needs to know which story to tell and where to be. What was your career journey? You're a journalist. Why did you want to be a journalist?
I had a deep love of English language and English literature, and I couldn't count to save my life. So it was never going to be mathematics or science or anything at that end of the spectrum. It was always going to be at the arts end. And I suppose I also had this sense of curiosity, and I loved to tell stories. And I think if you put all of that together, it points in the direction of journalism. Although I always remember my careers teacher at the school I will not name, who did that little test you do when you're about to do your A-levels to see what career might suit you. And one of the answers that came up on the sheet was journalism. He said, you might try journalism, but it's such a competitive industry, you'll never make it there. And here I am 35 years later, and I'm still swimming against that tide.
Now, we were all told that. So, where did you first do it then? Where did you first put a pen in a notebook and scribble down words or shorthand or whatever and try to get a story right?
At the Banbridge Chronicle in County Down. I was the junior reporter there, and I remember my first big assignment when I kind of stepped up into being a proper journalist at the Banbridge Chronicle. It was to provide a profile for a candidate in the upcoming by-election following the death of Harold McCusker, and that candidate, of course, turned out to be David Trimble, a man whose career I would later report ad nauseum. In parallel with my own career to some extent. I was only a short time at the Chronicle, then went to the Portadown Times, my own local newspaper, and I often say I learned far more from old hacks in those newsrooms than I did from anyone lecturing me in journalism, covering the council meeting, covering the petty sessions in the local court, quite entertaining often on a Friday morning in Banbridge, I can remember. And then eventually I ended up in Downtown Radio and Cool FM. That was my first job in broadcasting, and I did have an unusual knack of landing on the day when there would be a big story. The first day of my first, I suppose I should just say, my first reporting shift at Downtown Radio coincided with the Shankill Road bombing.
My word.
My first day at Sky News coincided with the Canary Wharf bombing. So I have this habit of baptisms of fire, I suppose you could say.
But editors will love that.
Steep learning curves. And I remember standing on the Shankill Road feeling incredibly out of my depth, as I still do on occasions now. Imposter syndrome is very real, even 35 years later. But I remember standing on the Shankill Road thinking, I'm not sure if I can do this. And I bumped into a chap you and I both know very well, Stephen Walker.
Yes.
And he said to me, just say what you see. And I've always remembered those words. That's exactly what I did.
There's a circularity about that because Stephen Walker is currently writing a book about David Trimble. So it's all happening because when I texted him, it was, don't bother me, I've got a deadline. So we know what that's like. So when you started in radio, like when I did, no digital recorders. It was all going on to tape.
That's right. And you brought the tape back to the newsroom. You got out your little bit of chalk. You marked the tape. And
your razor blade.
Your razor blade. And then quite soon into my career in broadcasting, we did move across to the big cartridges rather than the tape. But it still seems light years away from what we use now.
Cartridge was like an 8-track in your car, if you're wondering.
Exactly. Yeah. And once you were finished with it, you ran it over a magnet, so you erased it and it could be used again. But every time you walked to the studio to read the news, you would have had a bundle of about 6 carts, and on those were the reporters' various voice tracks about things they were covering around the country.
And there's a very famous story about someone trying to play a recording during a news bulletin, and the cart didn't start to play the cartridge. And so they said, oh no, my cart hasn't fired. And somebody was outside saying, do we call the fire brigade? What's just happened? It's the strange things people say. You mentioned things that happened, horrible things, like the Shankill bomb. And you're known because you have to go and cover this stuff in your years at Sky. You covered stuff to do with the Troubles. You covered stuff to do with the Good Friday Agreement and with Stormont and Dublin and Brexit and the global pandemic. People associate you with bad news, though.
Certainly here in Northern Ireland, I think they do. And very often people, even today, will say to me, you're a political correspondent, aren't you? And I'll say, no, I'm not. I've just covered a lot of politics because the peace process involved a lot of politics. At heart, I'm a human interest journalist and I want to tell people's stories. But many of those stories have been really tragic that we've told over the years. The Shankill bomb, as I say, was my first day as a radio reporter. The Omagh bombing was my longest simultaneous live broadcast. Went on air at 5 to 5 in the afternoon, didn't come off air until midnight with the death toll rising every hour as we went along. It was very painful and difficult. We lived on a treadmill, I suppose. You will remember this as much as I do. Well, we lived on a treadmill of violence, funeral, retaliation, funeral, violence, funeral, retaliation, funeral. And that went on for very long. And I often wonder, how did we get through that period of time? And it's only now really we are perhaps reflecting on it fully because the adrenaline kicked in. That was the antidote, I think, to what we were dealing with at the time.
What are the skills, the instincts that you need in doing the job? Because I'm thinking of a young radio reporter looking at the devastation and the horror after the Shankill bomb. And for any human being, that's upsetting. And yet you've a job to do.
Yes, as Stephen said all those years ago, say what you see and then find a way to release that. I have been married to an incredible woman for the last 30 years. Ruth has always been my place of release in terms of having someone to talk to about it when you go home. I've also many good friends involved in church life and not, with whom I've been able to talk about these things. But when I look back on it, I think that was very important, to not just gather the news as effectively as you could and to report it as effectively as you could, but also be able to release the steam, the pressure at the end of it. And I know it's a bit of a cliche, Will, but even in the midst of it all, I always found hope. You always met people who had hope to share, who were expressing grace in the darkest of situations, are people who were just offering you the kindness of strangers, as Kate Adie called it in her book.
There is a book that we've both written chapters for, and it struck me when I was thinking about this interview. I actually got it out and read again. I read your chapter and I read my chapter and then got stuck reading loads of chapters. And it's called Reporting the Troubles. There are 2 editions, or 2 volumes. We're in volume 2, in case you're wondering. Compiled by Derek Henderson and Ivan Little. Your chapter is about Michael and Sadie McGoldrick. Tell me about them.
Michael and Sadie McGoldrick, an incredible couple from Lurgan in County Armagh. They attended the graduation of their son at Queen's University on a Friday afternoon and then went to their caravan at the coast. Their son, to pay off his university debt, was working part-time as a taxi driver and was murdered at the height of the Drumcree Orange Order standoff, the parade dispute on Garvaghey Road, by the renegade Mid-Ulster unit of the UVF. And they discovered that their son was the taxi driver who'd been murdered by watching the news on breakfast television. I interviewed them at their home in Lurgan just soon after his death, before the funeral, and was incredibly struck by their sense of grace. They looked me in the eye. Michael McGoldrick said that he would pray for his son's killers. And that was, I suppose, reminiscent of what we'd heard from Gordon Wilson after the IRA bombing and the War Memorial in Enniskillen, when he also said he would pray for those who'd murdered his daughter. But when you're in the room looking into the eyes of someone who's expressing that level of grace, it does something within you. I remember the silence just lingering because I was so overcome by the expression of grace that I had nowhere else to go in terms of interview. The words just lingered in the air for a long time afterwards. And I think about the McGoldricks often because extraordinarily 3 days later, my phone rang, my mobile rang, and I answered it. And a man asked me if I would come and do an interview with him because the UVF had ordered him to leave Northern Ireland because his renegade unit, the Mid-Ulster Brigade, had breached the ceasefire to murder Michael McGoldrick. And that man was Billy Wright, the notorious loyalist paramilitary. And he feared for his own life, wanted to go on tape and tell me that he was ready to die for his cause. And of course, 18 months later, he was murdered in the Maze prison. So in the space of a week, I found myself sitting face to face with a couple who were expressing grace towards the killers of their son, and then 3 days later, sitting face to face with the leader of the group that had murdered their son.
You did another thing in that case, and I'm just going to raise it because people are better thinking about it. You said you interviewed the McGoldricks. And I know that that means that you and a camera crew, or you and your recorder, had to go to the door, knock it and say, hello, my name is David Blevins, blah, blah, blah. These people who've just lost someone in the most horrible of circumstances. How do you do that?
The door knock was always the hardest job. You must have done it dozens of times as well.
Yeah.
And often people think that's incredibly cruel, that's very cold-hearted. We're all vultures in the media for approaching people in these moments. It has been my experience that most people will either very gently say, no, I really don't wish to talk, and you accept that and you go about your business.
You go away, yeah.
But I've also been struck by the number of people who do want to talk because there is something cathartic about it. They find some healing in telling their story. Think about it like this. How often have you gone to a wake and you might be the 100th person through that door in the course of that day, but if a woman has lost her husband, she will still tell you what his final moments were, even though she's told it 99 times in the course of that day. There is some healing process going on there for her to tell you, oh, these were his final words and he took my hand and then he breathed his last, and she'll have told the same story over and over again. But there's some sense of healing in it. And that's what I have found with people as they've told their story, even if it's a very painful story, even if they get very emotional and there are loads of tears. It's about giving them an opportunity to do that and being careful to ensure they remain the story, that you are not thinking about how is this going to make me look. My editors are going to think this is a magnificent interview. My viewers are going to think, how emotional is that? I'm not the story. My network is not the story. What my competitors think is not the story. Those people are the story in that moment. What have they got to say in this moment?
I once interviewed a man whose daughter had been killed in a hit-and-run car accident a day or two earlier. He told me all about her, and he played tribute to her, and it was a beautiful tribute that he paid. And I got the interview in my radio recorder, and I went back to my editor, and he said, how'd you get on? And I said, well, this happened. And he said, well done. And I felt terrible. I hadn't done well. I hadn't done anything. A grieving man had told me his story, and he wanted an outlet for it, and I was privileged to be there to do that for him. But there was no kudos to me in any way, shape or form. So I completely hear what you're saying. I'm thinking about all those times in your career that you heard the complete silence in the aftermath of a bomb, or the shock as shots rang out somewhere in the district around you, or you could see and your crew could see through the tape and X number of yards down the road a body under a sheet, or worse still, not under a sheet. And then you have, and it happened to me a lot, so I'm sure it happened to you, overseas news crews arriving and just a bit too excited about it all, and just too delighted that they're there, and just too pleased that they've got a quote-unquote big story. That's difficult when it's where you live, isn't it?
It is, and it's even more difficult, arguably, when you have grown up in the part of Northern Ireland that is referred to as the murder triangle. In my days at Downtown Radio, now this will age me well, it was my pager before we had mobile phones. It was my pager that went at 3 o'clock in the morning more often than anyone else's, because tragically I happened to be the reporter who was closest to where the murder was taking place in Portadown, Lurgan, Dungannon, that triangle. And I suppose when I reflect on that, it was hard for us to see Northern Ireland as a war zone, but to correspondents flying in from elsewhere, especially London, this was a war zone. And this was their opportunity to make their mark as a war correspondent, where we never viewed it like that. No. And they would arrive occasionally in bulletproof vests that you see reporters wearing in the Middle East. We never wore bulletproof vests.
No, we did not.
In fact, if there was a riot in West Belfast, We ran towards the trouble rather than running away from it. There was no close protection officer with you in those days. We've become very health and safety orientated.
Become a lot more sensible, I think.
Yes, we have. And litigation conscious, I suppose, as well. And we didn't have those things. But yes, it was always a bit frustrating that they saw the job as an opportunity to make their moment. And I suppose travelling internationally now, I've got to learn from that lesson and be careful. I remember that this is where people live. This is their way of life.
I'll come back to that book compiled by Derek Henderson and Ivan Little. There's a line in their opening, their introduction, their preface. They say, "We depend on good journalists to inform and help us understand, but that work can be dangerous and high risk." Now, I'm going to think about a completely different kind of risk, because there were terrible wildfires in LA at the start of the year. You were there, and here you are standing in front of a burnt-out car, flames behind you, wearing a gas mask to protect you from smoke. So your voice is muffled behind that gas mask. Listen to this.
There are currently 6 major fires raging across somewhere in the region of 30,000 acres. It really is a staggering statistic. And there are fires popping up all the time. Even within the last couple of hours, we're hearing of one at Studio City. The scale of that, not quite clear at this time. But the big one, of course, has been in the iconic Hollywood Hills, just the latest exclusive neighbourhood to be engulfed in flames.
David, we talked about the changes to the way we approach situations over the decades that you and I saw in our careers. But it is important to be prepared. Do you want to take risks? Do you like taking risks?
That's an interesting question. Yes, probably. I am prepared to take risks in the interest of telling the story, not just for kudos. It's always about the story for me. The wildfires took me quite by surprise, because I'd actually been deployed to Washington, D.C. to cover the inauguration.
Other side of the country, yeah.
Yeah, Donald J. Trump. And I arrived in Washington to the worst snowstorm they'd had in a decade. So I found myself covering a snowstorm before the inauguration. And I had done lots of reading on the way there about President Carter, because his funeral was due to happen that week. I didn't cover one frame of his funeral because I had been deployed by that stage to the West Coast to cover the wildfires. It was unexpected, and in order to tell the story, I suppose you have to take risk.
You see, I don't think you do take risk in one sense and you do in another, because you're not going to put yourself in a very dangerous situation, or your crew, or your producer, or anybody else that's with you. If you've got a fixer in another country or whatever, you're not going to put them in a situation of risk, and you're not going to go somewhere that you can't admit to your wife that night that you went. But you're prepared to go to places and situations where most people in their right minds wouldn't go to tell the story. So you hit on something there that struck a chord with me when you said there's a riot. What did we do? We drove across Belfast or Portadown or Derry or wherever to get to it. I raced across the city of Bogota once to get to where a bomb had just gone off, because I wanted to see what had happened, and we're journalists and we want to know what's happened. So you'll put yourself in the way of danger, but you don't want to be put in danger, I suppose.
That's a much better way to put it, I suppose. And also, when you're deployed to some of those bigger stories like the LA wildfires, you have a slightly larger team with you. So you're not just thinking about yourself and your own safety. You are thinking about the camera operators, and I don't know about your experience, but mine has been that they will take more risk than the correspondent to get the picture, because the picture speaks more than any words.
And the viewfinder removes you from reality, of course.
It does. And so you're thinking about yourself, you're thinking about your crew, you're thinking about your producer. You're also trying to get your head around the scale of the story in a place like LA, where the wildfires were burning out of control. And I think so many tens of thousands of people had lost everything they owned. It was hard to comprehend it, never mind find words to explain that to your audience.
You're listening to the Commission Files. Time for a quick break.
There was once a time here when Bible copies were scarce. One person thought this wasn't right.
Brother Colum, you're making a copy.
Well, I need to make notes.
But you're making a copy of the sacred word. I cannot allow that.
Why not?
His name was Colum Kill, later known as St. Columba. His dispute went to the High King of Ireland.
To every cow her calf, and to every book her copy. The copy belongs to Finian. Colum, you've no rights to it.
I cannot accept that, Your Majesty.
Accept it or not, you must obey my ruling.
A battle ensued. Many people were killed, and Colum had to atone for what he had done. You must leave Ireland for good. You must settle somewhere where Ireland cannot be seen.
Exile? To leave the place I love?
Yes, you must. He sailed away to the north, towards the Hebridean Islands, and so began a far-reaching vision of the Word of God. Commission presents Breach of Copyright by Colin Flanagan.
This is the Commission Files with Will Leach, and I'm chatting with David Blevins, Senior Ireland Correspondent for Sky News. Have you ever stood at a riot and heard an angry crowd, and it can sound like they're baying for blood or in some kind, and any blood would do? Yours would do.
Yes, and I had a very difficult experience, I remember very well, during the Holy Cross crisis at Ardoyne in North Belfast, where we had been reporting, as every network was, every day live for about an hour in the morning as the children made their way to school, an hour in the afternoon as they made their way home. And I remember broadcasting live on the day the blast bomb went off. I was live on air on Sky the day the blast bomb went off, knowing that one of my colleagues with a crew was walking alongside the children. And so you're immediately thinking, are the children safe? Is my colleague safe? What's exactly going on up there? You've got to keep talking because you're live on air. And we continued broadcasting for the whole hour. And I remember the families came back down past us, the parents. There was so much tension that day, so much anger that day. And all they heard when they went back into their homes was the last 2 or 3 minutes of the live broadcast I'd been doing for an hour. So they hear a little bit of it completely out of context and think that in some way I'm not addressing my focus to where it should be from their perspective. And they became very angry and came out. And I wasn't just concerned that they were baying for blood. They literally were baying for my blood. And I had to calm them down and try to explain, actually, this is what I've been saying for the last hour. You've just heard the last little bit of it.
Yeah, not an easy situation to explain yourself. And sometimes you are called to explain yourself. I'm going to get into another situation about that. It's the way a journalist conducts him or herself. During those fires in LA, it was reported that the LA mayor, Karen Bass, was on a trip to Ghana and then came back to the USA. And you went to do what I was trained to call a doorstep interview. What's a doorstep, first of all?
A doorstep is when you take the opportunity, is probably the simplest way to put it, to just put a microphone under someone's nose as they walk out onto their doorstep, or as they, in the case of LA, step out of an airplane.
Let's hear what happened.
Do you owe citizens an apology for being absent while their homes were burning? Do you regret cutting the fire department budget by millions of dollars, Madam Mayor? Have you nothing to say today? Have you absolutely nothing to say to the citizens today? Elon Musk says that you're utterly incompetent. Are you considering your position? Madam Mayor, have you absolutely nothing to say to the citizens today who are dealing with this disaster?
Now, let me just help people imagine that. The mayor didn't make eye contact with you, didn't answer you. Other people were concerned, but it was essentially a standoff where the only voice was yours. Was that nasty, pushy, in your face, David Blevins? You harangued that poor woman who was just off a plane.
It was David Blevins, I think, doing the job of a journalist, holding power to account. Politicians are elected by the people, for the people, and journalists ask questions for the people, and I feel that's what I was doing. And I think we gave her every opportunity to just graciously say, I'm just returning to this crisis. All she had to say actually was, my heart is with the community, I'll make a statement later, and she would have silenced me. It was her deafening silence that caused the problem on that day, I think, for Karen Bass. I wakened the next morning, by the way, and that clip had 27 million hits on TikTok. So my editors were delighted with that. I did feel somewhat guilty, but at the same time, I was also just doing my job. I will tell you the background to that. We were flying from Washington, D.C. to LA when my cameraman had boarded the flight, and he travels a lot in the US, so he collects his points. And he used his points to upgrade because it was a 5.5-hour flight. He wanted to sleep. We were waking at 5 a.m. to go to LA. And so he's sleeping at the front of the flight. I'm in cattle class at the back of the flight. He wanders down the aisle halfway through the flight, sits down beside me in an empty seat and said, I think I'm sitting beside the mayor of LA. At which point I said, you can't be serious. Half of the United States is looking for the mayor of LA. She's gone AWOL in Ghana somewhere where she was on some visit. He went back to his seat. She had put on her jacket. On the sleeve of her jacket said Karen Bass, Mayor of LA. The rest of the flight was spent strategizing between him at the front, the producer sitting in the middle, me sitting at the back on WhatsApp discussing, my initial approach was, we'll ask her for an interview. The producer said, no, let's not do that, because if she says no, that's the end of the matter. Let's just try to doorstep her. When she steps into the terminal building, she stepped off the plane and we could see her security detail. We're going to take her through a side door of the air bridge. So the interview, or the doorstep, was done in the air bridge, not in the terminal.
Did you have any jip for that? I mean, did her security detail, were they unhappy with you? Did they try to stop you? Did they try to silence you? Did you get the arm across the camera? Any of that stuff?
An aide with her kept stepping into my space and then telling me to step out of her space. So they were trying to interrupt the attempt to doorstep, but her security detail also had a problem because the door to the air bridge didn't open. So I'm sure they had their knuckles wrapped because they were the reason she had to stand there for 90 seconds listening to questions from David Blevins. But the clip absolutely went viral, and the next day, when you know what this is like, if you flick on your social media, you expect to be criticised immediately, because if you interview one side, you get a lot of criticism from them. If you interview the other, you get a lot of criticism from them that it's not fair, it's not balanced. Interestingly, I only had pushback from about 3 or 4 people around that doorstep, and you would expect much more than that. So I think there was some understanding of the fact that it was her job as the mayor to answer questions about the tragedy that had unfolded.
You see, I'm willing to bet that you've been told you're a supporter of the Make America Great Again movement. Imagine you've been told you're a Democrat. Imagine you've been told you're a disgraceful Brit who doesn't understand what's happening in America. When you were working and returned to Ireland, you'll be told you're a Republican, you're a nationalist, you're a loyalist, you're DUP, you're UUP, you're Brit, you're who knows what else. And as long as you're told all those things, I think you're probably getting it right.
Exactly. And for a period of time, I would have pushed back occasionally. I've just completely stopped doing that, because when you actually look at the people who are replying to you, either they are anonymous or else they've got 3 or 4 followers. So if you push back, you're giving them the oxygen of publicity they so desperately seek.
So you're working in the USA. Are you about to go back?
I am. I'm not going to use the word coincidence, because all of these things are planned. Last July, I've worked a lot in the US, actually. The first time I was deployed there was immediately after 9/11. Again, that's giving away my age. But Sky often would do that, would send people from one bureau to another to reinforce the team in busy periods. So last July, I was deployed to the US after the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. The rest of the team from Washington were at the Republican National Convention in Wisconsin, which meant I was the only duty correspondent in Washington, and I was on duty the day that Joe Biden left the race for the White House. Found myself commentating on air for about 3 hours about the President of the United States having made history by leaving the race at such a late stage. Then they said to me, we'd like you to go back in November because you were so involved when he left the race in July. Again, they broadcast through the night the results of the election. I came on at 5 a.m. in the morning with Gillian Joseph on the roof. Wisconsin's called for Trump at 5:25. So my claim to fame last year was that I was live on air when Joe Biden left the race, and I was live on air when Donald Trump won the race, and I'm not a US correspondent, I'm a visiting correspondent. So they then asked me to come back in January because it got terribly busy around. They knew it would be busy as this administration flooded the zone to cause shock and awe, their words, not mine. And 1 month in January turned into 3 months, February to May. And 3 months, because of the world's fascination with a man called Donald Trump, are about to turn into 6 months, and I'm being redeployed from June until December.
I'm going to play something that's probably going to surprise you, but it's something you did on air. It's about America, and it's a poem. And I'm going to get your thoughts on it when I've heard it. Here it is.
America by Walt Whitman. Centre of equal daughters, equal sons, all alike endeared, grown, ungrown, young or old, strong, ample, fair, enduring, capable, rich, perennial with the earth, with freedom, law and love, a grand, sane, towering seated mother, chaired in the adamant of time.
What on earth is going on there, David Blevins?
There was a little series on Sky News about poetry at one stage where they asked various correspondents around the world to just share a little poem, and it was my turn. That's simply what happened, and actually coincided with the Northern Ireland Bureau in Washington also doing a poetry week, and so it was inspired, perhaps the choice of poem by them requesting it as well.
Let's change tack. What's your faith story? Why are you a follower of Jesus Christ?
I had wonderful parents. My mother, thankfully, still with us. She's 86 years old, a retired nurse. My father died when he was a very young man, but my parents were wonderful Christian people, and we didn't just grow up in a home where they talk the talk. They absolutely had a practical, lived out Christian faith, and I'm so blessed by that, privileged by that. They were Methodist, although I would describe them as Pentecostal Methodists. And my mother had this phrase, well, she used to say to us, God has no grandchildren. In other words, their faith could not be our faith. We had to own our own faith. So some people will kind of tell you they have a faith because they've gone to church, because their parents brought them to church. My mother always said, God has no grandchildren. And in due course, I then decided that I would follow their Jesus, as I would have described it then as a child, really. It all got a bit bumpy when I turned 12 because my father died of cancer at the age of 46, just as me and my twin brother were entering adolescence, the moment of your life arguably where you need your dad most. And if I look back on that, I was very angry with God because we just believed that he would beat this illness, that God would take us as a family through this. But God chose to take him home instead. And I think I was quite rebellious from about 12 until 18. And at 18, I realised, you know what, nothing is going to give me what St. Augustine describes as rest. O God, our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee. It was that sense of rest from everything else that I was exploring in my teens. And at 18, I found my way home and really committed myself to follow Jesus. And I love the fact that you've used that term, because people often stop me and say, you're religious, aren't you? And I'll always say the same thing. I'm not religious in the slightest.
Have they spent any time around the two of us?
But I have a deep faith in Jesus Christ, and those are different things.
Yeah. You mentioned Ruth, you mentioned family. So you married Ruth in the mid-90s. Tell us a little bit about your family, though.
My mother and Ruth's mother did a bit of matchmaking. They are both retired.
They did not.
They did. They're both retired nurses from Craigavon Area Hospital, and they set us up on a date, believe it or not. So we have our mothers to blame for that. But Ruth and I have been married 30 years last year. We've 3 grown-up children. Sarah is living in the United States, married to Josh, who's from Indiana. They've 2 little girls, Clover, which has got to be the most apt name for an Irish-American child, and Cece, Cecilia she is, but they call her and we call her Cece. And then my son James and his partner Mia have a little boy, Judah. So we've 3 grandchildren, 2 girls and a boy. And then our youngest son, Josh, will be 21 this year. The baby's 21, which makes us feel very, very old. So that's that's our family.
So you've been in news journalism for your entire career, except you haven't, of course, because you left at one point and studied theology, which I can guarantee virtually no other journalist has ever done.
Very few. It's almost unique, if that's not an oxymoron. I became very involved in short-term, what's the way to describe it? Short-term mission at one point. I was introduced to a couple called Stephen and Angelina Cowan, who are working in northern Kenya, a little place called Toom. It is the most remote place I've ever been to on earth. When you land at Nairobi, you're not even a third of the way to Toom, and you've been on a plane for 9 hours. It's at least a 2-day Land Rover trek from Nairobi to Toom, well off the beaten track. They've been there for nearly 40 years now, working with the Presbyterian Church in a very faith-based humanitarian aid programme with various parts to it. And I went on a Boys Brigade trip there in 2002, and it had such an impact on me. I went back 10 times in 10 years to volunteer on their programme. And as part of that process, somewhere I thought I had this sense of, I'll not say calling, but desire to explore theology a little further. Now, you will remember this well. Lots of people put 2 and 2 together and got 5 and decided that I was answering a call to the ordained ministry. That was not the case. The sense of calling was to dig deeper and explore theology. And I went to Dublin and did that at the Irish Bible Institute for 3 years, a degree in applied theology. And at the end of that 3 years, God does what he often does, opens the door you don't expect. I thought perhaps I would have a sense during that time that I was some sense of vocation to ordained ministry. That didn't happen. Instead, God opened the door back into journalism, and that's where I've been ever since. And people will often say to me, what are you doing with your theology? I'll say, I'm using it every single day.
We're in an age where people generally don't trust news media the way they used to. It's very fashionable to say it's lies or there's conspiracies, and we're going to hear what you think about that in a minute. I once was live on the radio, and this memory's just come to me, interviewing a really well-known politician. You will have interviewed that person, and it was in a local radio station. And when I raised a difficult issue for that person's party, it was a man, he said, "Oh, haha, fake news." And I, as politely as I could as an interviewer, utterly went for him, because I was really annoyed, because he'd made an outrageous claim. Now, he'd effectively called me and my colleagues liars, and it really doesn't matter if my feelings are hurt or my colleagues' feelings are hurt, but I don't want anyone listening to think newsrooms do make stuff up and do tell lies and think they can get away with it, because we're held accountable, and we always were, and so we should be and should have been if something's done wrong. But we're all human, and we make mistakes and we correct our mistakes. But we are in an age where people don't trust you, and there you were studying getting at truth.
Yes, because I don't actually believe in post-truth. People talk about the post-truth world, but if I've got one truth and you've got a different truth, we can't both be right. Someone's wrong. One of us is wrong. And I was determined to dig down into the truth in every sense of the word when I went off to college. But that decision actually opened so many conversations for me. So many people, when I came back to the media, and I include among that First and Deputy First Ministers, unlikely people would say, "You were off studying theology, what's that all about?" And you had this opportunity to share a little of your faith journey with them. And they, I think, heard a little bit more of your heart than they would have heard previously, because you had been authentic about your faith. I've always been very open about my faith, because far from my faith making me partial or biased, I think it does the complete opposite. People will say, does having a Christian faith not influence how you report? Not in a negative way. It doesn't stop me being impartial. It fuels my impartiality. And I'll explain what I mean by that. I'm not a citizen of this earth. I'm passing through here on my way to a different place. If you're passing through anywhere on your way to somewhere else, you don't have time to form attachments, to make allegiances. Instead, you're an observer on your way through. And so I think it is that eternal perspective that fuels my impartiality rather than making me biased as a reporter.
You must have been asked by good, solid Christian folk in the Northern Irish context, because we know what that phrase can and can't mean at times. How can you possibly do that job amongst all those terrible people if you're a believer? Either you aren't or you shouldn't be there. You must have been told that.
Yeah, but it's a misunderstanding of the great divide between the sacred and the secular, because no such divide exists. They obviously don't read enough C.S. Lewis or Tolkien, because, it's none of that's the case. You bring the sacred into your everyday life. There is no divide for me between the sacred and the secular. I don't do, God on a Sunday and then go into work and behave differently. God comes with me 7 days a week.
I'm going to quote something you said in a talk you gave at Stormont, because it absolutely fascinated me. Listen to this.
We live in a world of full stops. Orange or green, full stop. Leave or remain, full stop. Science or conspiracy, full stop. In a world of full stops, we need more commas. The comma creates a pause. When did we last pause instead of rushing to express our own opinion? When did we last pause to think about why we view the world the way we do? When did we last pause for a cup of coffee with someone who holds a completely different view and really listen? It's fashionable to blame the news media for the polarization. And sometimes that's justified if we give too much airtime to the extreme views. But having been a journalist for more than 3 decades, I can assure you there is no mainstream media conspiracy. In fact, there is no such thing as the mainstream media. There's credible, verifiable fact, and there's conspiracy that spreads like wildfire. The world has always been a place of diverse opinions, and that's a really good thing.
Explain.
I don't yet know why this happened, but to mark my 30th year in journalism, Ulster University were very kind and conferred upon me an honorary doctorate. You joked about it at the beginning.
I did joke about it, yeah, because I was making fun of you.
And you get to make a 4-minute speech when they confer that upon you. And during that speech, I used one line, "In a world of full stops, we need more commas," and got a standing ovation unexpectedly. It just resonated with the audience. So a couple of years later, when I was asked to do a TED Talk at Stormont to mark the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, I decided just to expand upon that concept, because I do think we live in this world of full stops. People are one thing or the other, full stop. And commas, they don't just create the pause, they bring clarity to a sentence, and you'll know what I mean by that. You remember the great front page cover of the Pet magazine a few years ago that said, "Rachel enjoys cooking her family and cats." All you had to do was put a comma and it changed it. She was no longer a monster. And then also a comma means the story isn't over and there's still an opportunity to finish that story well. So that has become a bit of a mantra for me, whether it's here in Northern Ireland where there is such division, where people, I'm orange or I'm green, full stop. I fly this flag or the other flag, full stop. In a world of full stops, let's create the pause. Let's bring clarity by having sensible, healthy conversations. I mean, well, don't you just long for healthy political discourse instead of bombast? We're just bombarded with meaningless phrases like "make America great again" or "take back control," or what's the latest one? "Stop the boats." I quite like boats, actually, but there you are.
Or "I've got my country back," or whatever.
Yeah. But what do they mean in reality? Let's get back to the days of having conversations that broke down divides in Northern Ireland not that terribly long ago and changed the course of history for this little place.
I'm thinking way back to earlier in our conversation when you talked about the McGoldricks. And I've waited till now to ask you how much the job has made you think about, ponder, dwell upon the nature of forgiveness.
A lot. we wouldn't be where we are today in Northern Ireland if some people had not found a level of grace, at least within their hearts, a desire to look beyond the hurt, to seek to understand why another person thinks the way they do. How were they raised? What was their environment? What has created their worldview that makes it so different from my worldview? And that parallels with the church in many ways, because I happen to believe the worst thing we can do is create a sense that of demanding that people believe what we believe, that people think the way we think. We need to have... we need to display grace, and it's from that grace I think forgiveness comes.
Have you ever prayed with someone you've interviewed?
I'm sure I have. I'm trying to think of the example.
A man once opened the door to me when I knocked his door. And he opened the door and I said, "Hello, my name's William Leach. I'm from BBC Radio Ulster." "Oh, you follow Jesus?" Because I saw it in his eyes. And he did say, "That's the most remarkable sentence anybody has ever said to me."
You said it to him?
I said it to him, yeah. I could see it.
Wow. I'm sure
You're not meant to do that, by the way.
No, I'm sure I have. I just can't think of the example off the top of my head. I might before we finish.
I'm really poking just at how the need to depend on God as you're searching for correct truth, something you can present as verifiable truth in a world that just wants opinions now.
I'm sure at some point I have prayed with people I've interviewed. It doesn't immediately come to mind, but the one thing that has often happened to me is people have said to me after I've interviewed them, "You're a Christian, aren't you?" And when I dig a little deeper as to what made them reach that conclusion, they will say it is because of the way the question was asked, the way that I approached them, the sense of empathy they've talked about a lot to me over the years. And my own pastor often puts it like this. It's just 4 words. He'll say to me quite often, we belong to Emmanuel Church in Lurgan, and Pastor Phil Emerson, many people know him, says, "Trust what you carry." Sometimes you don't need to say, "I'm a Christian." If you're in a professional capacity and you're not really supposed to do that at that moment in time, sometimes it's just carrying your faith into a room, being the presence of Christ in that room without any sense of preaching to those people, or the way you share your faith is to just trust what you carry.
David, thank you so much for sharing about your calling and about what you do. We could go on and on and on, but I guarantee no one clicked listen on this podcast to hear 2 old journalist duffers reminiscing about
maybe
their
they
careers.
did.
Well, yeah, thank you, Mum. But otherwise, thanks so much for being part of the Commission Files and for being so candid and fascinating. I know it is very weird for a journalist to be asked questions, particularly probing ones by another journalist, so every blessing as you head off to assignment again. And thanks to all of you for listening to the Commission Files. Don't forget our website, commissionradio.org. You'll find links to our YouTube channel, Instagram and Facebook pages, everything you need to know about our studios, the latest news, how to listen to all our podcasts of the Commission Files and the Bible Drama series. And we'll be back soon. Bye.